Good afternoon. My name is Navratil, and I'm currently an undergraduate student here at SUNY Geneseo. And let me just say, I love language. That's what I study in the English department here at the college, doing everything from writing poetry to analyzing the world's most influential literary texts. And I can't help but believe that words have power, not just as objects themselves, but in the ideas that they can convey. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about right now, what I believe to be the most important word, the word with which we understand all other words, hermeneutics. For those of you that don't know immediately what this word means, I find that there's a bit of irony in that. Because every single one of you that is able to interpret and understand what I'm saying right now is actually using hermeneutics. Because hermeneutics is interpretation, specifically the interpretation of language. And as we talk about our visions for the future, I can't help but believe that at the heart of this conversation is this concept of hermeneutics and ultimately interpretation. Now, hermeneutics is typically associated with religious traditions, as the world's major religions are inextricably found in literary texts. The Bible, the Vedas, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, entire worldviews are contained within the pages of these books, and the practice of rigorously analyzing and discerning the meaning of these texts is called exegesis. Lawyers engage in a very similar practice when dealing with legislature, yet language is not the only thing that we interpret. Language is typically just the means we use to convey our interpretations of the world. Whether through scientific empiricism, divine inspiration, or trusting a friend's advice on a difficult situation, we're constantly forming interpretive frameworks that help us understand the world and our experience within it. These are our hermeneutics, and they exist beyond language. And it's with these hermeneutics that we're vision casting into the future. But let's be honest. We don't all have the same interpretation. It doesn't take much to see political controversy and religious schisms. I mean, Protestants and Catholics have the same Bible, Sunni and Shia have the same Quran, Democrats and Republicans have the same Constitution, and you and your friend were looking at the same situation. So what's the problem? Well, it's very often not the texts, but our interpretations of these texts that vary. And I want to say something right now that at first may seem a little controversial. You ready? Some interpretations are better than others. Or, said inversely, there are some interpretations that are just plain wrong. I think in language this is self-evident. For instance, if I were to say, "You're pulling my leg," are you actually up here on stage grabbing my leg and pulling on it? Well, if I'm speaking in terms of an idiom, then no. And if someone were to interpret my words and envision somebody actually up here on stage grabbing my leg and pulling on it, well, we wouldn't just say that this interpretation is different. We would say that this interpretation is wrong. And I don't think that misinterpretation exists only in the realm of language and semantics, but also in worldview. Let me tell you a quick story. So I have a nephew, and I absolutely adore this kid, right? He's 6 years old, about yay high, and as you can see, he loves to play. And one day, Jade and I are in the front yard, and let me tell you, we are having a blast, right? I'm throwing the football, he's catching the football, it's a good day. Yet the time comes for me to go inside and check on his younger sister who's taking a nap. So I call Jaden over to me and I say to him, "Hey buddy, I'm going to be right back, but I need you to not play near the road. Do you understand? Do not go near the road." Now the reason I'm saying this to him is because I have an interpretation of what might happen if my 6-year-old nephew plays near the road. So I say this to him and he looks back at me, he smiles and nods his head and says, "Okay, Uncle Kyle." And as I turn around and I begin to walk into my brother's home, I look back and what do you think I see? Well, Jaden begins to run toward the road. He's acting on his own interpretation, and as he is running toward the road, I can also see that he is completely blind to the fact that there is a truck hurtling 60 miles an hour right to where he's running to. So I do what any good uncle would do. I run, and I sprint as hard as I can, 3 strides for every one of his adrenaline thumping through my veins, and just as my nephew is about to run into the path of a moving truck, I lurch forward and scoop him up into my arms. The horn truck blares, I'm crying, he's crying, but everybody's just glad that Jaden's alive. And here's my point. Jaden had a different interpretation of the future. He didn't realize that he might die, or that he could even get hurt. And I don't think that there's a single one of you in here that's going to disagree with me when I say right now that Jaden's interpretation was wrong. This story, which for the record is completely rhetorical, and thankfully did not actually happen, I think this story exemplifies a simple fact, that there are times when we can misunderstand the world and the future so badly that it's like running in front of a moving truck. I think that it is completely illogical to believe that all interpretations are equally true. Yet many people persist in what's called subjectivism or relativism, which claims that there is no absolute truth and there is no objective or communal experience. Perhaps that's why some of you are uncomfortable when I said that there are some interpretations that are wrong, because who are we to judge? But this subjectivist, relativist approach to life has the West in a very dangerous and difficult position. It actually bars us from having a useful conversation, because if we can agree that there are some interpretations that are wrong, such as my nephew's understanding of what it means to play near the road, well, then we can begin to ask much more interesting and better questions. Questions like, how do we decide which interpretations are better, and what do we mean by better? From interpersonal relationships to politics and morality, everything from voting on legislature that determines the legality of choices like abortion, or the assassination of foreign generals, or the moral culpability of police officers in a country that was explicitly racist for much of its history. As we talk about our visions for the future and our hopes for a, quote, better world, we all have an interpretation, and some of them conflict. I want to ask the question right now, what is it that has most influenced the way in which the West perceives the world today? What has contributed to our cultural hermeneutic? And to begin answering this question, I want to start by looking toward the past 150 or so years of intellectual history, beginning with a concept known to literary theorists as the school of suspicion, or the hermeneutics of suspicion. And it was in this group that three thinkers were categorized: Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and Karl Marx. And these three individuals were skeptical or suspicious that anybody actually knew the truth of what was going on. In fact, they believed that most people were completely blind to the truth. Of course, asserting their own ideas is true, but in their own way, they kind of claimed to be the uncle that could see the truck coming. And I want to take a look at each one. First is Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a late 19th century philosopher whose writings span a critique of organized religion and Christianity, summed up in the polemic and prophetic phrase, God is dead. If you have heard of this before, then you have heard of Nietzsche. And what Nietzsche was saying in this was that our post-Enlightenment, scientifically advanced Darwinian civilization has made it no longer possible for sane, rational people to believe in God. And the fallout of this was nihilism, or the sentiment that nothing really matters. And Nietzsche's vision for the future, circa 1890, was that we would reject any claims to absolute morality, and that we would spiral into interpretive chaos with no ability to discern good and evil. With no Judeo-Christian ethic underpinning the Western world, we would have no authoritative framework to base our assumptions on what is right and what is wrong. This is what Nietzsche meant when he said that God is dead. But what do you think? Do you think that God is dead? Do you think that we're in a state of confusion regarding religion and morality today? How would you respond if I said that morality was not relative, but absolute? See, that's exactly what each one of these texts claims. They make an authoritative claim on the nature of good and evil. And if we use hermeneutics, right, a plain reading of them shows that they're mutually exclusive. In other words, they cannot all be right. But what is your moral hermeneutic? Where do you derive your interpretation of what is good and what is evil? And what is it that makes it authoritative? Is it scientific empiricism and academic rigor? Is it divine inspiration, or is it subjective experience? These are the questions that I want you to think through as you evaluate our visions for the future and you formulate your own. Next is Sigmund Freud. Freud founded the psychoanalytic movement in the late 19th century, and it was out of this movement that he brought into mainstream dialogue and conversation the concept of the unconscious. While Freud didn't necessarily come up with this idea, he is often credited with popularizing it. And for Freud, unconscious desires play a major role in governing the way that people behave. Freud was skeptical that anybody could give a completely full and true account as to the reasons why they do the things they do. I'm curious, how many of you in here believe that there are processes going on in your mind right now that are completely hidden from your conscious experience? How many have heard of the term implicit bias or unconscious bias? Well, this interpretation of our psychology rests on this concept of the unconscious. And as critical race theory continues to develop in our country, speculating on the killings of unarmed African Americans like Tamir Rice or Oscar Grant or Tanisha Anderson or Ronisha McBride or frankly way too many others, well, what is it that informs our opinions on race relations in the United States today? Well, I'm not here to say whether these were motivated by implicit bias or explicit racism, incompetence, or mistake. I hope at this point Freud's influence on our conversation regarding race relations is self-evident. And lastly, I want to talk to you about Karl Marx. In 1848, Marx published the Communist Manifesto with another man named Friedrich Engels. And it was in this book that they described their interpretation of all of human history as a succession of economic systems, ultimately an economic class struggle, with the ruling and rich bourgeoisie subjecting the working class proletariat. And in this book, they called for radical change and revolution. Now, how many have heard of this? That at the heart of all human suffering is economic inequality. And if we could just level the playing field, well, then we could just usher in a utopia. Well, this, if you've heard of this, then you have heard of Marx. And an incredibly important point as we talk about Marx right now is his definition of the word ideology. Well, I'm sure we all have a somewhat vague idea of what ideology means. For Marx, it was very specific. Marx defined ideology as a veil or false consciousness that blinds people to the truth. In other words, what Marx was saying was that all interpretations of the world other than mine blind people to the truth. If you do not believe Marx, then you are blind, according to Marx. And the reason I'm talking to you about all of this is because I believe that Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud have deeply shaped our cultural hermeneutic in the way that we look at money, morality, and even our own minds. These men had their own hermeneutic, a hermeneutics of suspicion. They were scholars, but intellect makes no indication of virtue. I mean, the evil genius is a common character for a reason. I want to continue for a moment and test our hermeneutics, not only in the realm of language and worldview, but also in symbolism. Who can tell me what these symbols mean? The image on the left, the hammer and sickle, represents the successful implementation of a Marxist hermeneutic in the USSR. And the symbol on the right, swastika, represents the hermeneutic of Nazism. Without disagreeing over the means or the number, it is an unarguable fact that a staggering amount of people have been killed in the name of both of these interpretations. And to this day, on both the left and right end of the political spectrum, there are individuals that take them as authoritative. There are some in the country that I call home that would say that my nephew, remember the one who didn't listen and ran toward the road? Well, because of the color of his skin, they would say that he is inferior to them. While I'm not here to tell you what the perfect hermeneutic is, I can say without the least degree of suspicion or skepticism that the hermeneutics of white supremacy, of Nazism, and of communism, well, these are bad interpretations. But this leaves us in a difficult position because it's easy for me to stand up here and play Monday morning historian and look back on what has happened. But how do we address controversial issues today? How do we address political crises now? Well, my vision for the future, my hope, is that we can begin to have a conversation, not just stating what our interpretations are, but honestly talking about why we interpret the world the way that we do. And I hope that we can have this conversation with, above all else, humility, recognizing that we have been wrong before, and that we have a civic responsibility to lovingly confront others when we think that they may be wrong. I look to men like Daryl Davis, someone with the courage to speak with others so different from himself, that with the hope that through humble conversation he might win obstinate, racist, and human Ku Klux Klan members to the side of reason and compassion. Because of his willingness to dialogue, over 200 individuals have left the KKK. And I want to see more of this. I want to see more people make the bold and loving claims necessary to not just move toward a future, but to move toward a good one. My question for you is this: what is your hermeneutic? Why do you interpret the world the way that you do? And what is it that makes it authoritative? The health of our political system, the vitality of your relationships, and ultimately the future that my nephew will live in depend on how you answer those questions. Because who knows? Maybe you or someone you love is running towards a moving truck and you don't even realize it. Thank you.